There's no rules!
Shoot a lower score!
There's one rule!
Welcome back to the No Mulligans Podcast, where we're here in the studio at Franklin Bridge, and we just finished an episode talking about just how much dopamine hits we get in the day and just the constant noise and stuff. And I think it's just so refreshing to sit here in the studio and just like look out at the pitch black driving range at this point and just kind of just acknowledge the nature around us. You were saying that you took out a book at the library just on nature stuff.
I forgot how much I love the solar system and studying. Like,
oh my
do you
God,
understand how small we are? Like, there's this weird sense at the top of the mountain. You're like, man, I accomplished this. But in the very, like, sitting right next to that, we've talked about like holding two emotions together at the same time. Like, you can be confident and nervous all in the same moment.
Right.
You're like, yes, and at the same time, you're like, I'm this big.
Oh, I know.
Like, I'm nothing. I'm just
I
like
think
when I
that.
die one day, like I'm gonna be forgotten about.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
Right.
In the terms of, time.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so small. The universe is so freaking big, and I can see so much of it up here. It's cool.
You know what's interesting about that? And, I mean, we could probably have a whole podcast talking about this, but, like, I think what's cool about that is some people get scared at how big, like, the universe is.
And there's a certain amount of that that's probably sits there. I had some of that.
Well, like, to me, I find it comforting almost. Like, just because it's like, I
We're
truly.
the only living things out there.
Well, I don't believe that. That's what I'm saying. Is like, I feel comforted knowing that, like, we're not the only ones out there, and like there's so much more beyond.
I
what
feel
I can
confident knowing
comprehend.
that we are the only ones. Like,
Fair enough.
We're cared enough to be here. Like, if we are the only ones, and who cares if we're not the only? Like, I'm not in charge of all that. Like,
well, all this UFO stuff that's come along in the last.
Hey,
okay.
I have a funny story for you about that after the podcast.
We'll do like I think it'd be
Rebecca
fun.
and I saw something flying one time, and I'm
really?
not a conspiracy theorist at all, but I'm like,
I think it would be.
we saw this black. I'm just gonna tell you to you now. We saw this black object. We were flying southwest. It looked like it had to be like at most a half mile off, but it was just like holding still. We were above the clouds. It's just holding still in a singular place. Just this black.
Damn.
Like, I wouldn't call it like the traditional UFO shape, but it's just like this black blob just sitting there. And it was in front of the wing as we were looking at it. And as we're going by, we both saw it. That's the weird part. It wasn't like I just saw it and told her about it, or she just saw it and told me. I saw it, and then she's like, you seeing what I'm seeing? I was like, yeah, are you seeing it? And so we both look away, and we're about to tell somebody else, and we look back out there.
It's gone.
And it's gone. What is this thing that was in the sky? So I don't know. For all you UFO conspiracy theorists, an unidentified flying object doesn't mean that it's from outer space either. Like, it's unidentified. We don't know what it is. Anywho, that's a sidebar.
It'd be fun to do like an episode where we just talk about like that stuff.
Whatever we want to talk about. What were we talking about?
Well, I guess I'll do a little intermission here to go into what we're going to talk about. But thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast. It really means a lot. And I think we always talk about, hey, like, give us a 5-star rating or a review. One thing I want to challenge you guys with is that if you guys have found value for this podcast at all in the entire time that we've been doing it, would you just mind shooting it to a friend and be like, hey, like, you're a golfer, I'm a golfer, I thought of you when I was listening to this, just like tune in for a little bit. That'd be really cool. So we really appreciate you guys just sharing the podcast. It means a lot. And whenever we do the big back porch episodes where we blow it out and have a bunch of people, it's really refreshing to see 100 people on the back porch who listen to this podcast. Meanwhile, it's just 3 of us in an empty bay here in the studio.
Right.
So that's really cool. Thanks guys a lot. But hey, talking about something, we haven't done like a technique episode in a while.
Yeah.
This has normally been like a podcast to talk about like the mental side of the game, but we're going to be talking about wedges.
And some swing theory generally, I think, is needed.
Well,
those are always popular, right?
Let's dive right in then.
I don't like doing it, but I guess I need to. So Scott Spector was up here.
Yep.
This week. I haven't seen him in person for over a year. We've done a lot of FaceTime lessons, and once you get to, like, I've been teaching him for almost 7 years, right?
Yeah.
So, like, once you get to know somebody's game, like, you can kind of
you don't really have to be
don't have to be there all the time,
Yeah,
and he's done well in a lot of his senior tour qualifiers.
And think about some of the tour players too. Like they probably don't see their coaches in person the majority of the time, right? Because they're traveling all the time.
He shot 59 at Chateau Elan earlier this year.
Yeah,
like playing with some young guys too, and they're razzing him now. Like, hey, we got that tournament coming up. You gonna shoot 59 at the tournament? Yeah. So, no, that's pretty cool. So. Anywho,
hey, before you get started really quickly, because I was in here while you were giving him his lesson, and it's really cool because I've gotten to see you, give lessons to a bunch of people who are picking up the game or maybe, are
kind of average golfers.
Average golfers, 20 handicap. And then, like, when you give a lesson to me, it's just, like, it's way more technical, and I appreciate it a little bit more just because it's, number one, it's me, but number two, it's just super technical, and I really enjoy that. And then I come in here and watch you with Scott Spector, and I'm just like, yes, I finally get to see you do a lesson with somebody
super
high level, and it was just refreshing to see that. And so I'm excited to get into this episode because a lot of people are never going to see you teach a lesson like that, and I think that's something that people should at least have knowledge of what goes on in some of that.
And I'll say this: not most teachers can't span the spectrum. They can't go from teaching a uber beginner all the way to teaching a high level player equally well.
Yeah.
And that's something I strive to do. I obviously I have my fortes and my strengths, but I try to make them all equally that well.
Yeah.
And what's really neat is the hardest part when you're at the top, right? So like I'm going to be at the top here. Like nobody's going to come over me from an instruction standpoint.
Sure, yeah.
Ever while we're here.
Yeah,
so
no.
Kind of the end game for me. So what's holding me in check? And so as long as I'm asking the right questions, and I think I have people around me to help keep me humble, help me ask those tough questions, like Brooks is very helpful in that, and have other people I can converse with that helps. But for me, it's like asking the right questions. And so just trying to always be aware of, like, are there little habits and ruts I'm getting into as a teacher? Are there habits and ruts that I'm getting into as with certain groups of people? Am I teaching too many people to draw it? Am I teaching too many people the same hand action? Am I getting stuck in forms that are not helpful, or is that actually what's needed? So like asking those types of questions is good. And there's something that's changed in my teaching philosophy. And Scott Spector got to catch a piece of it while it's evolving. So rarely does somebody get to be a part of seeing that change, and to be able to present it to a player at that level shows the level of commitment to the thing that I'm shifting in my teaching philosophy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it wouldn't be out of the question for me to experiment with something like that with somebody that's kind of an average golfer just to see if it fits.
Yeah.
But at Scott's level, you can't take that chance, right? So you can't take that chance that you're wrong, right? You just got to do it right.
Well, and I think the other thing with Spector too is like you know his swing inside and out, so you can afford to take those risks just because you know that you can revert it super quick just because you know who he is.
The fun part is, like, he's got strong opinions about what he needs to do, but he's still very coachable in the right. You just have to know where is he coachable.
And that's how I feel like that is a theme with higher level players too, because they've had success doing what they're doing that you're trying to get them to do something else, right?
And that opinion matters.
Totally.
Except when the opinion's wrong.
And that's when you get a good I think that's really what separates good coaches and bad coaches, because you got to know when to put on the gas and when to hit the brakes a little bit.
Well, and it was to tie back to the previous podcast a little bit about us doing that whole hike out there in Colorado, like one of the peaks that I decided to stay back on, like, because my confidence was down lower about doing it, and I'd already decided I wasn't going to do it. Well, Erica's confidence was going up. I knew Elijah was going to do it. And so at that moment, when a coach realizes his confidence doesn't exceed the person he's helping or the person who's in his team, right? Like, maybe you're not trying to help him, you're just all on the same team. when that confidence is going to pull that group down, you have to back away.
Oh, dude.
So there's wisdom in like learning to, hey, I knew it was time for me to step back and let the two of them run free. It's like, hey, I can't carry you any farther. I can't be a part of you. You guys have to go.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, totally. And relating this to real estate a little bit, we're always taught when we're going into a listing consult is you have to be confident at what the house price is, because if you're not confident, then the other person will tell you what they think it's worth.
Right.
And I think the parallel to the golf here is just that when – this is actually like a study that happened – is that when two or more people are together, the person who is the most confident in what they have to do, everybody else will follow because of just the sheer confidence that person has.
Correct.
So if you have
whether they're right or wrong.
Correct.
That's the danger.
That's the key. So as for me in real estate, I've got to be super confident in what I believe that price will be worth, or else the other person will stomp all over me and tell me what they think it's worth.
This is why in us prepping for those mountains, we were considering taking a fourth person, but we had been wisely advised not to go more than 3, and multiple resources, both in a written form in a book called Colorado 14ers Disasters. So it's just kind of help you like why do these things happen? There's always a reason, and the reason why you don't take 4 is as soon as you get to 4, the weakest person and the strongest person may or may not influence that entire group. A lot of times a stronger player will not see the weakness of the other player or the other hiker and bring them along with them. Not only put the person who's weaker or not ready in a position that's dangerous for them, but as soon as you put somebody in danger, it actually puts the whole group and potentially other people in danger as well.
Makes sense.
So we didn't take 4, we went 3. And so
now, does that change if you go to like 5? Or is is 4
well,
kind of the
that's where
magic number?
Sherpas come in when you're doing really big stuff.
Sure,
right?
sure.
They have the wisdom to know, when we turn around, we're turning around. Regardless of whether you think you can go and the whole group thinks they can go. If I decide as the Sherpa we're going down, we're going down.
Yeah.
You want to keep going, you can, but that's at your own peril. Bye. I'm bringing the whole group down with us. So most of the time everybody goes with them.
Fair.
Right, but we weren't in that situation. So, but anywho, where are we going? I have no idea what I'm
Wedges.
talking about.
Gosh,
wedges.
hey, we might have to cut
wow,
some of that.
How we get that's okay. So, but there's this evolving piece of my teaching philosophy that came through an unexpected angle. We've done a lot of women's teaching and coaching this year. So anatomically, women are different than men in several categories, not just in the chest, but they typically have a lot wider hips. So initially, when we first did clinics this year, I taught my standard, the thing we've always taught, like you start with your feet together, the ball's even with your back foot. Like that's pretty much what everybody teaches for a low basic chip. Well, I found a lot of our ladies couldn't chip well doing that. And like you're watching from behind and watching how they rotate, watching from the front, watching how they rotate, like they're way out of balance because the bottom is narrower than the midsection. Like you don't see very many like high-rise buildings that are fatter in the middle than they are at the bottom.
That's a great point.
They're all wider at the bottom. And in wedge play, you need to be very stable so that the center of that motion is in the same place so you can make solid contact on every single swing. Right? Like that's the most important part of wedges is solidness of contact. So we have to maintain that. So I'm looking at that going, all right. So then you start stretching your own teaching philosophy a little bit. It's like, all right, I'm just going to widen their stance here and see what happens. All of a sudden, they're able to maintain control of where their weight is, which means they can control where the bottom of the swing is, which means now we can deal with the hands and arms. Like you may be trying to get them to rotate around a little bit to the left or let their arms swing to the left. Well, they couldn't do that if they're like an unbalanced top that's like wobbling all over the place. So the working theory is, and I asked some other teachers, I'm like, so like we go with the narrow stance. They're like, yeah, I mean, unless you're hitting a pitch, it's a little wider. But I was like, well, why do we teach it narrow? Well, to hit it lower. I was like, okay, I got that. We can hit it lower by just moving the ball back, which I normally don't like doing, right? So like that's a piece I like to maintain a singular ball position and change the trail foot. But in this particular situation, I'm like, well, the answer has typically been, well, that's just what we've always taught. Yes, it helps a more descending
which
blow.
Which is so dangerous in any any teaching or profession.
And if the ultimate answer is like that's the best thing to do in most situations, then cool. That's
Totally,
fine.
but you can prove statistically and through data that is the best thing to do.
Right.
But if it's just saying, oh, that's what we've always done, just to say that's what we've always done, I feel like that gets dangerous.
Well, and the typical answer is like you get a more descending blow, you make sure you make solidness of contact. I was like, yeah, but the stance is narrow. Like, so we stand people open, like, see, there's variations of an open stance to help you work left. Like, okay, but it's still too narrow. And so I watch people struggle to hit wedges solid. And then I'm thinking about, okay, well, we do that with, so I started shifting that in all of our ladies stuff that we did this summer and the start of this fall. And so literally this last week and a half, we've been doing that. And right before we left for Colorado, and I was like, I'm looking at Scott hitting wedges, and he's struggling to hit them solid into the grain here. He hasn't played on Bermuda in a hot minute, a few months. And so we're not hitting them solid. I'm like, all right, we've been working to get his weight off of his heels. That's fine. We got that. That's in place. I'm not worried about that. He's still not hitting them solid. I was like, Scott, widen your stance out. I said, you're catching me in an evolution of my teaching philosophy, and that is that the minimum width of the stance, with the exception of a specialty shot. There's always an exception, right? The minimum width of the stance is that the center of the ankle or the heels of each foot need to be at least the width of the center of the hip joint. So you think about a lady who has a 40-inch, or, don't just measure waist, but actually measure the hips.
Yeah.
Like right around that hip joint. I mean, that can get into 50 inches wider, and that doesn't mean she's overweight. It's just like you have wide hips.
It's the hips, yeah.
And so, plus they also typically have smaller feet.
Now, how does this parallel to like when people say shoulder width apart? Why, like?
That's just what we've always we've
always said, right?
Right.
But like, how would you describe that to somebody who's actually playing this? Would you say from where your foot naturally?
Well, think about
where your leg naturally hangs down.
Think about ladies. If we say shoulder width apart, well, a lot of them, their hips are just as wide, if not wider, than their shoulders. So, if you say shoulder width apart for a female, they're going to stand up there and have all this weight in the center, and they're going to wobble all over the place.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to control where that mass is in the center of your body, and so the feet are actually going to need to be wider. So then I went. So we had a couple of ladies today. If you look at their stance width, you think they're hitting like a 7-iron or a 6-iron. Like, that's how wide their stance is.
Yeah, wow.
But they're able to make the movement so much faster than I was able to make earlier this year. I was actually told the group today, I was like, man, y'all are either great students, A, which I think that's a part of it. We had some great ladies here. But I said, or B, I'm getting better at doing this.
And I guess for you're spot on there, and I think to relate it to the men, the women who are listening are probably like either standing up from their desk or like as soon as they park their car, they're gonna try and do this. But like for the men, I feel I'm doing this. I'm standing up right now. Is for the men, I feel like a way to probably feel how a female would feel this is to put your feet exactly together,
right?
Because
then try and make a chip,
and then try and make that chipping motion. It's just like, oh wow, like I'm about to fall over.
You can rotate just fine, but you're not stable.
But you're not stable, right?
That's
right.
correct.
So just widen the feet, which for us men is probably shoulder width. I'm putting parentheses around it, or quotations around it.
Yeah.
But
so where you're at right there
more solid
is pretty standard there. So if another way you could measure it, assuming you're not like super knock-kneed or bow-legged, would be if you were to draw a line from the center of your hip joint through the center of your ankle from a face-on view, like I'm looking at you right now, like you're hitting a shot away from us that way, right? So if I'm looking at you face-on, looking at the front half of your body, your feet, if I measure those lines should be slightly like Eiffel Tower-esque at the bottom, right? So the bottom should be slightly wider. It should be vertical to slightly wider. It should not be, if I drew lines down your legs, they should not be inward, right? So even though I have really narrow hips, like if I stand this way, which is typical, you'll notice that my legs are actually inward.
Inward, yeah.
So the bottom is narrower than the top.
The fat part of the triangle is at your waist instead of at your feet.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you want the fat part of that triangle Doesn't have to be a triangle. It could be just straight up, but it cannot. At the very minimum, it has to be straight up,
parallel to just a hair wider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, where you can mask it is people will lean their weight forward. Now you can't really tell whether that bottom's too narrow or not. But you can tell when somebody goes to hit a wedge shot. Like if you watch me do this right now with my stance slightly too narrow, if I go to hit a chip shot, where do my hips want to go?
Yeah, behind
They go
you.
backwards
because
they're trying to stay balanced because I know I'm going to get my chest and my arms in the right place.
You know,
that creates some instability in the contact. And people are like, well, does it really matter for me? Absolutely it does.
Yeah.
And at Scott's level, maybe we're only talking about an average of like, let's say it's only every wedge shot will include bunkers, chips, pitches, 50, 60, 70, 80-yard shots. So like anything under 80-yard shots. If we're looking at that piece, maybe it's only 3 to 5 feet closer on every chip, which doesn't sound like a lot, right?
Oh, it is.
But like if that bunker shot goes to 15 feet, if it goes to 8 instead of 15, well, that make percentage goes from less than 30% to 50.
Yeah.
Right? So at his level, that's the difference between shooting 67 and 70.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no
kidding.
And
it's just maybe it's a 20-foot putt or a 25-foot putt that's now 15. The make percentage is higher, right? You do that enough over the course of enough rounds, that's going to catch you on the positive.
What I was I was saying this before the podcast started. I told you I was just like saucing my wedges recently. Like just they're awesome. And what I've noticed, and I think we always talk about this, the athlete in me. I let my instincts take over more than I do textbook by the book, is I feel like a lot of teachings will say, well, put the ball further up in your stance or further back in your stance, depending on how you want to hit it. Okay, if I want to hit something super low, of course I'll put it back. If I want to hit something super high, of course I'll put it in the front. But for anything that's, let's say, like, 30, 40 yards, I'm putting that ball smack dab in the center of my stance. And I've been like trying to figure out why, because it's all been based off solidness of contact, not necessarily teaching perspectives or philosophies. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's exactly what you're describing. It's just the stability. And where do I have all my feels? In my fingers and in my hands. So if I set up my base correctly, it doesn't necessarily matter where that ball position is, more or less, just because I have that feel in the face to where the stability has really been the problem and not necessarily the hand motion.
Yeah, the phrase I've used is wherever you start is wherever you stay with wedges.
Yeah. So
it's learning how to hold that position in place, and most people, I would say, they've been told to keep their stance narrow. I taught this.
Yeah.
I taught this for the last 13 years,
yeah.
and it's just shifting.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, which is okay.
Of course.
Right? So
it means you're innovating as a teacher.
Right. And I don't think I've made anybody worse per se.
No.
I just may not have made them as good as I can make them.
Correct, yeah.
And so this is becoming a staple of my wedge teaching. And you think about a child as they're learning and growing, when they're 8, 9, 10, that stance could be pretty dang narrow.
Yeah.
And the boys and girls, you're probably not going to see much variance because you haven't had all the puberty changes that go to the wider hips
Good
with
point.
the females.
Yeah.
And the men's hips stay narrower. And so those things start to change. And as they change and evolve, that changes things.
Mm.
And so now, similarly, so think of a lady with this is going to sound terrible, but think of a lady with a larger chest, but still, not all women have super wide hips. Not all men have super narrow hips, right? But as a whole, there's anatomical differences between the hips.
In everybody, yeah.
But there are some women who are very athletically built, very straight form, because they have super low body fat, but their chest is fairly large. Well, they act the same way. That center of gravity is much higher, and so it's unstable. So now that foot width, remember I said the minimum is the hips. Right? That's the minimum.
Yeah.
So they may, depending on their build, go a little wider. I have some men, so I don't know if our Uncle Mike is listening to our podcast, but it's Rebecca's uncle, but everybody calls him Uncle Mike. So I call him Uncle Mike. But Uncle Mike might have the broadest shoulders of any human being I've ever met. And he's only 6'3", 6'4", but his shoulders look like he's 8 feet tall. Like his shoulders are so wide. Like if he stands behind you, Jack, you can see his shoulders to the sides of yours.
And I'm a pretty broad guy.
You are right. He is a super broad-shouldered guy. Well, he's a case where he's kind of like the women with the wide hips. His chipping stance, now that I'm thinking about it and evolving over it, needs to be basically like a normal full 7-iron stance.
So how do you – my question to you now is if you're listening to this at home and you're trying to determine what that is, what I'm hearing you say is there's no real answer. It's just –
there's a minimum.
There's
the only thing I'm
minimum.
set on.
Yes, correct.
I'm
There's only a minimum. But at what point do you just kind of say – do you just widen it out until you feel like you've got control over that smaller swing? Or how do you describe – like if somebody's listening to this at home, how do you start setting up that new stance based on what you're talking about?
So easy test is going to be start at the minimum width, which is going to be the base of your feet needs to be fractionally wider, like just a tiny bit of that Eiffel Tower look in your legs.
And if we say the base of your hip joint, we're meaning like where your leg meets your hip, like the ball and socket that is in
right
your
where
hip.
that ball is. Like if you were to press down in there, you can kind of feel that. I don't know what the
Tate, what's
the attachment in the hip on the front side, whatever muscle or tendon that is, that you can feel. Like if you're thinner, you can feel it like attached right there on the front.
Yeah, your groin muscles there.
That's your psoas, your...
Yeah, I mean, it's that whole quad, like, all your... I mean, there's a lot of leg muscles there.
there's a lot of attachments.
He's like, that's a very complex part of the body.
He's like, which one are you talking about?
Yeah, which of the 8 are you talking about? Yeah,
it's going to be, like, if you can feel your hip bone on the side there, you're probably going to want to be at least that wide, if not slightly wider than that. So at the very minimum, if you draw a line from the center of your ankle through the center of your thigh, that should be minimum vertical. Shouldn't have any, not a degree inward turn. So that's the minimum. I would even garner to go slightly outside that where your legs look slightly angled like a wider base of a high-rise building. That's the minimum. Start hitting shots there. Assuming you have a proper movement, right? So at least close to a proper movement. Hit a number of shots there, then try to widen it a little bit. There's going to be a place at which you lose control of solidness of contact again. At that point, you've hit your max. Unless you're talking more of a full shot. But if you're staying inside of 50 yards, then there's going to come a place at where if you get it too wide, you're no longer going to be able to control contact as well. So, like, for Uncle Mike, he might be going, okay, I started at that minimum. Like, man, I'm getting pretty far out here, and I still haven't hit it solid yet. Oh, now I hit it solid. So there's more variables. Where's the ball go? How much weight do you set forward? Where are your hands relative to your chin? Like, there's a lot more variables, but the piece that's changing in my teaching philosophy is there's a minimum width at which that stance should be for your hips.
Would it be fair to say that regardless of who you are or what your build is, you need to build that triangle that has the wide base at the bottom and then tapers up into your hips?
That's correct.
So you need to have...
It doesn't need to be a lot. I'm not talking like
correct.
You shouldn't have a 10-degree angle. That's too much.
Yeah.
It's going to be just barely.
Gotcha.
And we did that with Scott, and that cleaned up that contact, and he felt the stability regain. I could see his weight in his feet all of a sudden transfer the way we want. Bang. When we're even with the longer wedge shots, like 50, 60, 70.
Is that something that when he goes off of Bermuda again, he's still going to keep that philosophy?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha.
So there may be, like, if it's super wet, but even then, like, I was thinking if it's super wet, then you need that stance narrower and the weight more forward. I was like, well, now you're unstable again.
Yeah.
And so, no, that's not it. Maybe it's just the ball moves. So the piece that I'm having to be okay with, like, all right, I've changed that piece of my teaching philosophy. What else does that require me to change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that may require me to be more of a floating ball position, at least when it comes to wedges.
But the one thing that stays the same is wherever you start your weight, it needs to stay there.
That's correct. That's unchanging.
So just takeaways as we end this podcast here is that you always want your base to be wider than your hip joint.
It has to be at least the same.
At least the same, if not wider. And wherever your weight starts, it has to finish there.
Mm-hmm.
And it honestly has to stay there.
Right.
Yep.
It can rotate.
Correct.
But it has to stay.
It has to stay in the place where you set it. Yep.
That's correct.
So those are the two things that
no
you would
up and
say.
down.
Correct.
No left and right. No forward and back.
Just rotation.
Just rotation. and some arm swing.
Would you say that those two are like the guiding principles for you right now?
Yeah, for right now, those are the two like non-negotiables for
Okay.
wedges.
Cool.
So
Well, hope you guys learned something new. That was cool.
yeah, so you're kind of catching me as that's changing, but it came through a group I didn't expect it to come through.
Well, and
Which
I
is
think,
super cool.
Well,
Like,
I
I'm
think-
teaching something from my ladies
Yeah.
class beginners to one of my tour players.
which is crazy to tie this whole episode together. Is we were talking earlier about a lot of teachers won't run the gamut between beginners and all the way up to the tour players. But what we're learning here is that if you're able to do that and you're willing to tell
Listen.
yourself that it's not always how it's always been done, you can start to learn something and then start to
Right.
innovate off of that.
It's super cool, man.
Which is what is what. That's also where BP and OP and POA came from as well.
right. It's just like asking the question like, wait, why don't we just like test this out?
Sometimes you have to be curious, and sometimes you have to take a break from all the noise to really understand what you're trying to do. We're tying both episodes
enjoy the
together,
wonder,
baby.
Enjoy the wonder.
Enjoy the wonder. Cool.
So-
Well, yeah, that's awesome, Scott. Thanks a lot for that. That's cool, man, and I think that's something that everybody who's listening can implement in their wedges. So, from Scott, Tate, and Jack, y'all, thanks so much for watching. Please share this podcast with your friend who sucks at wedges. We all have that. We all have that friend that fats their wedges, that thins their wedges. Send this to your friend who sucks at their wedges. They will thank you. So from Scott, Jack, and Tate in here in the studio at Franklin Bridge, remember to like, subscribe, follow us on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify, Amazon, wherever you guys are listening to this. Thank you all so much for supporting the pod. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.
There's one rule!